Girl Confessional podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Lowries, and the Good Girl Confessional podcast is proudly brought to us by WB40, Women Beyond 40, a magazine and website for women 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 even, and beyond who want to talk about the real stuff. You can check us out at WB40.com. Before I begin today's podcast, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded and where I work, live and play. And in my case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Today in the podcast, I am very excited to be talking to an extraordinary writer. Her name is Marsha Gordon and she's coming to us live from North Carolina. She has spent the last 5 years writing about an extraordinary woman who we all should know about, but strangely we do not. She is, of course, talking about Ursula Parrott, who was an incredible writer. She wrote 20 books from the 20s to the 40s. 10 of her works were actually created into films in Hollywood. So she was a major player. People like Humphrey Bogart actually starred in her films. Her first book, The Ex-Wife, became an international bestseller, and the book was actually made into a Hollywood film called The Divorcee. How do we not know about her? Well, it's a question that plagues me as well, because when you read this incredible book, Marsha's book, Becoming the Ex-Wife, The Unconventional Life and Forgotten Writings of Ursula Parrott, it is absolutely mind-numbing that we don't know who she is. She made hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time during the Great Depression. Her life is extraordinary. Please welcome my extraordinary guest to the Good Girl Confessional, Marsha Gordon.
Hey, it's another Sandy here, Sandy Davies. I'm the founder and formulator of Happy Paws Balm for intimate dryness. Find us over at happypaws.com.au. That's happypause.com.au. And get some happy on down there. And in the meantime, keep listening to Powerhouse Sandy Lowries on the Good Girl Confessional podcast, where every woman has a story.
Marsha, and welcome to the Good Girl Confessional podcast, all the way from North Carolina. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Sandy.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us, because I know over there it's nighttime and over here it's morning. It's the magic of technology means that at least we can get together.
Absolutely. Much easier than flying. So
yeah, really true. And is it warm in North Carolina right now?
It is warm in North Carolina now. Yeah, we are in full on late June, upper 80s, humidity, mosquitoes, the whole thing.
Wow. Yeah, we're we're meant to be in the grip of Melbourne winter here, but I must say it's quite mild. So,
good.
I know we can't really complain too much. It is chilly. It's chilly, but it's not freezing. So there's that.
I'm jealous.
I am so excited today to talk to you about your extraordinary project, your incredible book, which is about the love. I'm going to read this so I get the title right, because it's a bit of a long title, but it's a brilliant one. Becoming the Ex-Wife, The Unconventional Life and Forgotten Writings of Ursula Parrott. I am going to make a confession here, as I often do in the confessional. I had never heard of Ursula before your book, and I cannot actually believe how I could not have heard of her and how the world has not heard of her. How are we not talking about this extraordinary woman?
Well, this is the reason I felt I had to write this book. So if you had heard of her, you would have been one of a very few people. I have almost met nobody who had heard of her before I started talking to people about her. So she was so famous. She was such a prolific best-selling author, went to Hollywood, 10 films made from her various writings, and she completely disappeared and got erased from cultural memory of 20th century American literature and culture. And so when I came across her story, I went through a long process of, trying to figure out what this was. And I realized one day, if I don't write this book, who's going to write this book? And if I don't write the book, nobody knows who Ursula Parrott is, right? And I felt that that was a crime. And so I was so blown away by what she managed to do and the things that she discussed at a very early time in thinking about especially women's issues in the 20th century and this changing time. But I was like, my goal is to write this book and to help bring Ursula back into the conversation. And hopefully people will start reading her and talking about her and thinking about her again.
Oh, and I'm so grateful that you have, because what an extraordinary pioneer. Like, it's fair to say, reading your book, that she had an extraordinarily colorful life, but
Yes.
she was witty and brilliant and intelligent and fearless in some ways, in many ways, for a
Yeah.
woman living in those times. And we're talking, you know, like, you know, she wrote what, 20 odd books at least, you're saying,
Yeah.
from the 20s to the 40s. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, well, so I think that living on the kind of cutting edge of things and risk taking, that was often to her detriment, but it made her incredibly interesting. And just to give a little context, so she was born in 1899 in Boston. And, father was a Catholic family doctor, and she went to Boston Latin Girls School, which was the female equivalent of the Latin boys' school. What wouldn't have called it boys' school because that's the only people who could have gone there. And one of the conditions for going to this Boston Latin Girls School was that your parents had to promise that if their daughters wanted to go to college, that they would send them to college. So this is very, very progressive education, right? In the 19
Wow.
teens.
Yes.
And so she went to Radcliffe College, which is, of course, the female offshoot of Harvard. And so she's part of this generation of women who had all of these educational opportunities. And this was partly also because of where she was born, right? She was from Boston, from the Northeast, where there were these progressive values about women in education. If she had been born in Nevada or Utah or Oklahoma or North Carolina, where I live, she would not have had these same opportunities, right? So part of what allowed her to be so kind of intellectual in her pursuits was her background.
Yeah, wow. And I guess before we delve more into the beautiful Ursula, because I'm so fascinated by her now, how did you first hear her story? How did you stumble across this story? I mean, I can see by
Yeah.
the beautiful poster that you have in the background there that you're clearly enamored by films. Look, oh my God, beautiful. For those who can't see it, it's a film poster of, is it The Outrage?
It's called Outrage. Ida Lupino directed film. One of the two women who directed in Hollywood in this period of time. So
beautiful.
So
I can see that you're fascinated by women of the time. So
Yeah.
how did you stumble across Ursula, though?
I'm so glad you asked that, because this is one of those great stories of how projects get started that, it's a reminder that we always have to keep our eyes open, because you're never going to, you don't know what you're going to stumble across. So I was doing some research at the University of South Carolina. They have a collection of screenplays of F. Scott Fitzgerald that were never produced. So MGM, hired F. Scott Fitzgerald to come work on a bunch of screenplays. They were sitting in the archive, and I was like, okay, I want to go look at those. I was, happened to be there. And I had a short period of time, so I could only pick one screenplay to look at. And so I looked at the finding aid, and I was like, well, this one's called Infidelity. That sounds pretty good. I'm going to read that one. So I had them pull Infidelity, and I'm reading, and I'm looking at the notes, and I had a notebook with me, and I was taking notes, and it said that it was based on a story by Ursula Parrott. So F. Scott Fitzgerald, like America's most celebrated author of the Jazz Age, is hired by MGM in 1938 to work on a screenplay adaptation of a story by Ursula Parrott, a woman I had never heard of. And I wrote, who is Ursula Parrott, in my notebook. And so I actually thought and pursued the path of writing a book about these F. Scott Fitzgerald screenplays for almost 2 years while I was doing research and contextual research. And I ended up getting so fascinated by Ursula Parrott's story that I just had this day. I remember sitting at my laptop going, does the world need another F. Scott Fitzgerald book? There are hundreds, there are thousands. No one has ever written about this woman. I had to buy the copies of her books on eBay. I had to find them at used bookstores. Nothing was in print. And they were so amazing. When I read Ex-Wife, which we'll, I'm sure, talk about in our conversation. I was like, this is an important, stellar novel. It's an amazing read. Why isn't everyone reading it? And so I just said, okay, I am diving into this. I'm going to write a book about a woman no one's ever heard of and who has no books in print, which is kind of an exercise in insanity, but that's what I decided to do.
Oh, I'm so pleased that you did. And as you said, after I read your book, I actually went scouring everywhere thinking, I wonder if you can get hold of her books. Almost impossible, I've got to say, as you say, unless you're like dealing in secondhand books, etc. Although, I'm kind of hopeful now with your book that they're going to start to reprint. And have they reprinted one?
I have good news for you. Yeah, so I had nothing to do with this. This is the universe finally giving Ursula some love. The week after my book came out, McNally Editions republished Ex-Wife, Ursula Parrott's 1929 bestseller. Anybody can now pick it up and read it. And I cannot imagine that you would be disappointed by the experience of reading it. It is a page turner. It is about such contemporary issues. And now it means that people can teach this novel, in their curricula. If you teach high school, if you teach university level, this is an amazing opportunity to bring this woman into the conversation. And I really think she deserves a place there. So I hope that there will be more republications of some of her other work. I'm trying to talk to people about it. I would love to edit a collection of her short stories and her correspondence and some of her nonfiction. So I hope we can get more out in the world.
Oh, I hope so too. And I'm super excited about that. And I cannot wait to buy myself a copy because I'm so, as I said, I am enamored by her. I'm now an Ursula fan. And that's because of you. And I mean, I think that that's quite an extraordinary thing. This is not, an unusual thing, unfortunately, that women have been kind of eradicated from the history books in all sorts of arenas. And we talk about science and we talk about, Hollywood, and we talk about a lot of arenas where women are just kind of forgotten, which is so horrible. But it does us all a disservice when we think about the fact that women like Ursula, and Ursula in particular, really paved the way for other women to be able to write about their experiences, because what she was writing about was almost taboo in her time. She was talking about being, creating stories about ex-wives and single parenthood, single motherhood, at a time where people would just sweep that stuff under the rug. And she was clearly talking from her own experiences because she'd lived those things, right?
Yeah, and I mean, in Ex-Wife, there is a horrific rape scene. There is a absolutely moving abortion scene. I mean, keep in mind, abortion and birth control are equally illegal in the United States in this time period. So she was talking about these things that impacted women's bodies, women's lives, like whether you like it or not, it's part of being a woman in the world. And these are the things, and try to imagine it being, the late 1920s, and you get divorced, you go through these experiences, you decide to write a thinly veiled, piece of fiction about it. It's not 100% from her life, but a lot of these incidents are from her life. And then, it's published anonymously, which was not to protect her. It was a marketing gimmick, because anytime you publish anything anonymously, it means like, oh, there's something really juicy in there, right? So her name was attached, a few printings in. Everyone knew she had written it before her name was even on the book. And then you become like a spokeswoman where you are like talking to the press about what it means to be a divorcee, what it means to have to work to support yourself because your ex is not supporting you, what it means to raise a child on your own, because she had a child, who she raised with the help of her sister and her father in the beginning before he passed, with the help of boarding schools, because she had the means, the way an affluent person raised a child back in those days, especially in the Northeast. But she was out there like as a spokeswoman for these really thorny ideas. I mean, some of these things people would have a hard time talking about even now, right? Especially in the United States with the way abortion is kind of circling through the kind of legal system. And so I'm often in awe when I think what I would have felt like 100 years ago, stepping out on a stage with this as my agenda. I don't think I could have done it.
No, and I think that was the thing that struck me really about her was her extraordinary courage, the bravery
Yeah.
to do that. And as you say, we're looking at a political climate now, not just in the USA, but it's
Yeah.
predominantly in the news about the USA, about these sort of, abortion laws under the microscope again and
Yeah.
Roe versus Wade and all of these things. This was so far before that even happened, before the
Yeah.
women's movement of, the second wave feminism and,
That's right.
in the 70s. And so I think Ursula, like, what a gutsy broad, and I use the word broad because
Yeah.
that's what they would have used back in the day, but
Yeah.
incredibly gutsy and courageous. And yes, she wrote it under a pseudonym, anonymously. She didn't write it under a pseudonym. She just
Yeah.
said it was anonymous. I love that because, as you say, it's very much a marketing ploy. And she knew at some point they were going to find out who she was. One thing we should say about The Ex-Wife is that this became a best-selling novel. So the reality is it resonated with a lot of people. It
Yes.
obviously got picked up by lots of people because it was a best-selling novel.
It was. And so this is also one of those amazing things. When I realized this, I just kind of had to sit with this for a minute. Ursula Parrott's big first paycheck came in October 1929, the month of the stock market crash that triggered the Great Depression. So here's this woman who had been like divorced. She was working in department store advertising in New York. She was supporting her son. She was, trying to live the life of a single woman in New York in the 1920s. Very Sex in the City, kind of precedent life. And she writes this book. It becomes a bestseller. She gets this big check. This novel is a sensation. I mean, everyone knew who Ursula Parrott was, certainly in any metropolis, but this was being read across the country. Hollywood comes immediately and sweeps up the rights. It gets made into a movie called The Divorcee in 1930 with Norma Shearer, one of the biggest stars of the day. She gets her only Academy Award for performing in this film. So this is like, she hit the gold mine, out of the gate. It's like the most visible novel and movie in this 1929-1930 period. And it really is an extraordinary testament to the fact that she kind of put her finger on the pulse of something that was happening in the culture with kind of changing values, changing status of marriage. And, the reviewer in the New York Times kind of looked down his nose at the novel, but he made two comments that I think are so interesting. And I will say again, he made two comments that I think are interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One is he left the book out on the couch, he says, and his wife immediately grabbed it, and her friend sat over her shoulder and they read, couldn't stop turning the pages, right? So in other words, he was being a chauvinist and saying like, okay, women will like this book without saying it explicitly. But the second thing he said was, Ursula Parrott has created, and he didn't say she created the word, because of course people have been talking about the idea of an ex-wife for some time, but she really popularized the category. Like, she saw that there was a category of woman now, the ex-wife, that hadn't really existed before. And she kind of gave it body, like this idea that there are so many divorcees now, that it's becoming like a category of identity. And so he credited her that, even though he was very snobbish about the book.
But she had the last laugh in a way. Well, yes and no.
Yes.
I mean, in a way, like, the ex-wife being an ex-wife, just becomes part of the vernacular everywhere around the world after
Yes.
this book gets launched, right? And it was almost like, you could say, yes, I'm the ex-wife, whereas before it would have been like quite, as you say, we sweep it under the rug. We don't talk about it. We hope no one in the room knows that I'm an ex-wife or whatever, right?
Well, it's actually so funny because there's all these parody books that come out, ex-husband, ex-baby. I mean, that's like my favorite title. But so it's like, it's that big of a thing that like all these downstream parodies come out that are also no doubt making money for, the publishers.
Oh, no doubt, 100% they're making money for the publisher.
Yeah.
So I think that's fascinating, as you say, because it becomes a film. So Ursula, 10 of the books that she wrote, all short stories.
Yeah.
There are 10 films out there created from
Yep.
her work, which is quite fascinating. And as you said, even to find out that, F. Scott Fitzgerald's writing a screenplay based on a short story that Ursula wrote, I really tried to visualize what it would have been like for her in those times. Like in some ways, it would have felt like the world was her oyster. But one of the fascinating things you write about her, which I really want to chat about, is that she didn't always see this as being a great thing. So
Yeah.
in some ways, coining the term ex-wife, even though she didn't, but it became really synonymous with her,
Popularizing it. Yeah.
coining that phrase was a great thing in some ways because she was making a lot of money,
Yep.
and she was, being interviewed, and she was writing for all these prestigious magazines, and she's living this lovely life in New York City, out in Manhattan, and doing all these incredible things, as you say, very Sex in the City before Sex in the City.
Right.
So in some ways it offered her a really great life, but in other ways she felt it really trapped her.
Yeah. Yes. So her life is so complicated. One of the things I have found very interesting about not just researching her, trying to understand who she was, kind of reading everything she ever wrote that I could get my hands on, including her private correspondence, and really trying to wrap my head around the contradictions of being Ursula Parrott and being any person, right? Like nobody is, fits neatly into a box. But I think she is an especially interesting character because she embodied a lot of different contradictions. So on the one hand, I do think that she felt very earnestly that the best thing that could have happened to her would have been to meet, fall in love with, and be married to one man for the rest of her life till death do they part. I think that's what she wanted more than anything, more than even the success maybe. Because keep in mind that success was partly born of the disintegration of her first marriage. Ex-Wife, to be clear, is not a novel that celebrates divorce. It's not about how awesome divorce is. So I want to make it clear that this is a Jazz Age novel. It's filled with all the speakeasies and all the things, but it's a cautionary tale about what happens in an age of marital impermanence. And it's not a pretty picture for the most part. And so it's not just like, yay, we can get divorced now and look for our next husbands, like this. It's about the downstream consequences of cultural change. And so Parrott wrote that from the heart because she wanted, I think, more than anything, to find the right mate, to find a man who would respect her career, would respect the fact that she had a son. She wasn't looking for a father for her son. She was fine raising a child the way she wanted to, but she kept making really bad choices. So she got married and divorced 4 times total. Each one, a train wreck for a different reason. She looked at marriages around her, like, for example, her agent, George By, who was, her kind of, I guess, biggest advocate, and really tried to take care of her as much as he could for someone who was, a wild child who wanted to do things on her own. But she looked at his marriage, his 40-plus year marriage, with a sense of such envy. I mean, she writes letters to him saying, I look at what you have, and it's like you live in another universe than I do. And it was with envy. And so I think it's interesting because I think people understood her, like her first novel, if you read reviews of it, people didn't see it as a cautionary tale. They saw it as another, like, society's going to hell in a handbasket. And it's, this is just about drinking, brandy flips at the Speak, but that's not what it was. And that is part of what I find so interesting about her, is that she had a real conservative desire for a family that she could never figure out how to achieve.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I think one of the most fascinating things I read that you had written was that she didn't consider herself to be a feminist. And I found this really fascinating. And we still battle with these concepts even now, where you have women who say, they're quite happy to live with the outcomes of feminism, but they don't want to call themselves a feminist, right? It's quite fascinating. And Ursula was no different, and so she'd sort of, in some ways, had all the benefits of what had happened with the suffragette movement,
Yep.
even the fact that you could get a divorce
Yep.
really was quite liberating. Even if you didn't want to be, like, and in her case, I know, you don't always want to be divorced either, but it
Right.
was a time of benefit in some ways to some women because of the suffragette movement. We had the vote suddenly, which was quite extraordinary. But also too, she said, I'm not a feminist. And, she didn't always agree with what the feminist movement had done for women moving
Yeah.
forward and kind of made our life more difficult, she felt.
Yeah. So this is one of the other interesting contradictions that she embodies. First off, some context. In the 1920s and in the early 1930s, there was this kind of backlash against first wave feminism. Um, and Parrott is obviously like thinking through what the consequences are for some of what the kind of that first wave won for women. So the vote, she doesn't comment on the vote. She's a voter. She said she's a Democrat. She always votes. She volunteers for the local ward in New York. And so I don't think that's the stuff she's talking about. What she's talking about, there were people, by the way, who were like, women should vote. We should have left that to the men to make them feel like they have something that's theirs. So that was in the air. What she was more concerned about and really kind of asking or really kind of questioning if the feminists had thought through this was that with the kind of push to equality for like the vote also came this push towards equality in education, equality in employment, basically being perceived on completely equal terms with men. And what she saw was that there were consequences for that. One of the consequences that she was concerned about was that if men felt that women could support themselves, then that meant that they didn't have an obligation to them in a marriage. So she talks about the fact that, like, look, marriages might have been dull for my grandmother's generation. Yeah, he definitely had affairs, but he kept his commitment to the wife and he supported her. He took care of her. She didn't have to worry about looking Forever 21. She didn't have to worry that she would have her home ripped out from under her. And Parrott talked about the fact that, like, look, I'm working at this department store, like after she's divorced, looking around me, and everyone here is divorced. They're all working to like put together their meager earnings so that they can support themselves because they've been cut loose in the world and they weren't prepared for this. And so I think what she was doing was trying to get people just to have conversations about and think through some of the downstream consequences. I think she kind of felt like this all happened so fast. And, it really did, if you think about it. If you think about the chronology of women getting access, there was many years of advocating for this, right? And fighting for it and protesting for it. But the vote, education, opportunities in professional life, there is a sense that like there was this kind of tumbleweed movement forward, and that some of the repercussions, they happened. They weren't like, oh, we thought about this and here's what we can do to help navigate around this. And so this is part of a larger conversation that was happening in the culture. And Parrott was just like one voice saying, like, I'm worried about these things. I'm worried about women not being prepared to like live the life that could happen if you are so successful that your husband can't keep pace with you, and he feels professional envy, and he's going to blame you for his lack of success. And so this is one of the contradictions that she embodies.
Yeah, but it was an important conversation she was trying to have, because really, when we look at it in 2023, these conversations are still happening, right?
Yep.
We are still facing this. I was watching a television show the other day, which was some finance guru, and he was talking to this very young couple, and the young woman was hugely successful doing what she was doing. And the young guy had decided that, to stay home and take care of the kids. And he said he felt, emasculated, and he felt like he wasn't contributing to his marriage and his household. These are conversations still going on today, which is so mind-blowing.
Yeah,
when you see these young hipster couples going, I still feel the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. And keep in mind, this is a conversation that's happening in the 20s. And then
right?
Yeah, post World War I, right? After World War II, this conversation happens again. And actually Parrott at that point is still publishing. So she starts writing a series of articles about how, men who have come home from the war have made their wives stop working while they, like trap them in the house all day, like that those marriages are going to fall apart. So she sees like version 2.0 happening. And then, this is something that just keeps cycling through this question of what it means, to be aligned, with a kind of a cultural expectation, and what happens when you start disturbing that. And it takes a long time for cultural expectations to change, right? There's a lot of back and forth. And we're still not at a place where everyone is comfortable with there being parity, across the board.
Very true. And we're still talking about, as we just mentioned before, we're still talking about, pay parity, and we're still talking about abortion laws, and we're still talking about, all of those things. And you're right, there was this massive backlash. So against the first wave of feminism. So we see like in the 50s and 60s, women grappling with a whole lot of other issues, still fighting for the right to, body autonomy and abortion rights, and still fighting for women's liberation in terms of, well, I don't want to have to give up my job as soon as I'm pregnant. I don't want to have to give up my job when I get married. All of those things, and to have a right, as you say, to go to university and to have education. And in some ways, like we're still seeing that in certain parts of the world now, there's still this kind of push for this for some women. We're not there yet, right? So Ursula's conversations were so powerful. The fact that she was having these conversations in the 20s and the 30s and in the 40s, still writing articles saying, hey, hello, we need to be talking about these really powerful things. Women exist in the world. We're here. We're not going anywhere. And we need to have these conversations.
Absolutely. And let me add one other thing, because even though she expressed some disdain for feminism, she was a feminist, right? This is a labeling
totally was a
question.
Feminist. That's what I'm saying.
And I mean, I think if she were alive today, I'm going to do something really irresponsible and make a speculative claim. But I think if she were alive today, she would understand that differently than she did then. I think, for example, the fact that she talked about in her letters, like being sexually harassed by one of her publishers, trying to go get a loan at a bank, and the banker suggesting that she exchange favors with him instead. And she said, look, I will pay you interest just like every man who walks in this bank. I mean, she saw these kind of structurally sexist things and called them out, so she was, it's not so simple as like, she didn't like feminism. She wasn't a feminist. She was a feminist. She just, she was troubled by some of the consequences of feminism and wanted to raise the question of how to solve those problems, because there were no answers, right? Like there was not like a textbook you could get, like what to do when, when this happened. So she was raising those issues in the culture, and she was doing that in her writing, but she was also trying to do that through her films, because she knew the reach was so great. And, when you said like, there were 10 films adapted, I mean, Jimmy Stewart's first leading role was in a movie that Ursula Parrott wrote. It's called Next Time We Love. It was originally titled Next Time We Live. They retitled it because they were afraid people would think it was about reincarnation, which is really funny. But, Humphrey Bogart was in one of her movies. These are major stars, major films. She was a player in this world, and she was a player partly because she was writing these novels and stories that really spoke, especially to women readers, and to women audiences, which was always Hollywood's primary kind of target in this studio era.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things, and I should have clarified that earlier when I talked about she didn't consider herself a feminist. I should actually say that in reading all about her, I consider her very much a feminist. And so I was trying to understand, that the duality of that, because you kind of go,
Yeah.
well, I see her as this extraordinary feminist for her day, speaking out on top, because talking about topics that are difficult and hard, and you know that you're going to get backlash for, is not easy, right? And this is the thing about powerful feminist leaders, and that's how I view her, as being a powerful feminist leader, because she, as you say, she was doing it through her art, through her medium, which was writing, and she's an extraordinary writer, because you don't keep getting published if you crap. You don't have your, screenplays and stories picked up to become movies if you're a terrible writer. As you say, she struck a chord with people of the day. They really understood what she was saying. One of the fascinating things you write about is through all of this work that she did, she earned hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time, as you say, when there was the Great Depression happened, and she's earning all this money. This money's coming in. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, so in addition to living, I would say, an extravagant lifestyle, she liked her furs, her jewelry, her cars. She loved to travel. She felt like she was a better writer when she traveled. She would travel to the Bahamas all the time. She said a bunch of stories there. She did an extended trip to Europe and Russia in the 1930s and set a bunch of stories there. So she thought she was a better writer when she was on the move, and she loved it too, right? But she bought a big country estate in Connecticut, actually two. One, sold it, then got another one, where her sister and her son lived. So it was just outside of New York City. So she could have her apartments in the city, work in the city, play in the city, go out to the country and spend time with her son there. She was a big gardener, but she was not a good saver. And she was not financially prudent. And, in this, of course, she was not alone. A lot of the very rich authors of the jazz age, F. Scott Fitzgerald is a perfect example, had no idea how to be responsible with money or alcohol. They shared that as well. We can talk about that too. But she kind of blew through everything she had always. She was also incredibly generous. Every reference I've read in kind of correspondence with her sister, for example, would say what? You keep buying people these extravagant gifts and doing all these things for others. She supported the domestics who raised her after they were, after her father passed away and they were aging. So I think she had a generosity, and she didn't have a good sense of the value of money until it was really too late for her. So she kind of blew through everything. And her longtime agent really tried to get her to, pay things off and to live responsibly, especially, as the Depression wore on, magazines couldn't pay as much, publishers couldn't pay as much, right? So this was a long period of economic contraction. But yeah, man, she made so much money. She got in trouble with the IRS for not paying tax. There's a bunch of really tragic financial stories, but she did like to spend it. But she also saw, Sandy, she understood that part of her capacity for spending was compensatory, that she was buying herself all of this stuff as a kind of salve for her kind of emotional emptiness, that her disappointment at the way so much of her personal life, her romantic relationships did not work out. And so again, to me, that's so prescient that she saw that. That's so many people struggle with this. Why do I do these things? Whether it's too much food or alcohol or shopping or gambling or whatever, to make myself whole, to try to make myself whole. And she has characters who express this even in her stories, because she often, wrote from her own life. So she saw the flaws of her own character.
Hey there. When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly.
Yeah, she did. And I think that there's something extraordinary about great writers is their vulnerability to be able to put their lived experiences into their characters or through a story.
Yeah.
Because it's difficult for people to talk about the hard stuff, right? It's always easy to talk about the great stuff going on in our lives.
Yeah.
But it is difficult to talk about the really tough stuff. And God, she went through some tough stuff. Like this is the other thing. I see Ursula, even though things went south and they didn't go great for her in the end, I still see her as an extraordinary resilient woman, as you say, working. Like, she was hugely successful in her career at a time where a lot of people were struggling to even put food on the table. She was raising a son. She was taking care of her sister. Her sister was helping with her son. She was taking care of other people. I just think hugely resilient and quite amazing, especially because at the time she's carrying this massive void, this heartache that just never kind of went away for her.
Yeah. I would say resilience and optimism were these two essential character traits, along with wit and intelligence, I should say. She was such a wit. She's so funny. But even when the chips were really down for her, she just tried to get back up on the horse and start over again. So when she was having these kind of struggles, she was drinking too much. She struggled with alcohol her entire adult life. She would go through periods of time where she would say, I am not drinking. I made a bunch of bad decisions. I'm not drinking ever again. And then she would come back to it. So she really tried. And this is, keep in mind again, the times. Alcoholism is not considered a disease. There's not a vocabulary for talking about it. The kind of cures are just beginning to bubble up in the culture. So many writers of her generation who had this kind of great wealth and success and visibility drank themselves to death. And she did not do that, but alcohol certainly did not help, I think, her decline. But even in the 1950s, when she was basically trying to kind of pull herself out of rock bottom, she had ended up homeless. Walter Winchell, the very famous columnist, reported this in his column. She ended up at a Salvation Army shelter. She ended up then finding a room at a boarding house in Brooklyn. And she convinced someone at her publisher, her old agent's office. Her agent had left her a few years before, but convinced someone that she could write her autobiography and that would sell because she had been through so much. And she outlined what the autobiography was going to be. And her new agent, was paying for a typewriter rental for her. And she kept saying, I'm going to be getting you pages soon. I'm going to be getting you pages soon. I've also started this new series of short stories. I mean, I'm trying to picture like this woman who once had everything and then she's got nothing. And then she's like, I still have the ability to write. I can get out of this mess. And, I don't think she produced the pages. I don't know what happened, but they're not in her file at her agency. So I'm assuming that at some point they just gave up on her and the typewriter went back and she continued to subsist however she was subsisting at that time. But I'm so moved by the fact that she was trying so hard. And she has this one line in one of her letters from this period. She said, I don't want to make any promises because I'm afraid I won't keep them. And she said it in a funny way. Like you could tell she was being a little, but I cry every time I get to that part because to me, it's
heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking. It's so, like I wish I could scoop back in time and kind of clean her up and sit her down and say like, okay, like but nobody was there doing that for her. And I don't entirely know why. I know she was hiding. So she told this agent, don't tell anyone where I am, including family. So she did not want people, I think she had a lot of pride and she was like, I just want to get my act together. And, it had worked her whole life, right? She had done a bunch of like pendulum swings up and down, and she always ended up. But, that can only last for so long.
Yeah, because that really struck me because I was like, at the end, where was her son? Where were all these people that she had helped,
I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I could tell you. I will say this, the thing that she was proudest of, I think, in her life was that she sent her son to Harvard. And this was something she was, her agent and dear friend had already said, like, look, I can't work with you anymore. But she mailed him a copy of her son's admission letter to Harvard because she was so proud that he was going to Harvard. So, and her son was very successful. I don't know if they knew where she was in the end, and were there with her, when she died in a hospital, in New York. The challenge, of course, with writing a book about somebody who was not valued or famous at the time of their passing is that there's no Ursula Parrott archive. I can't just go like, oh, I'm going to go to the Parrott archive and do all my research. I had to like scour the world trying to find traces of her. So like, there's a couple of letters at the Smithsonian because one of her lovers was a very famous artist and art collector. There's a couple of letters, at the Harry Ransom archive at the University of Texas because she exchanged letters with Alec Waugh. And then her agent and one of her lovers, who became a very well-known New York Times correspondent, kept every letter she ever wrote them. So the agency files, and then this personal correspondence. So I was able to read, it's something on the order of 600 plus letters. So what I wanted to do in this book is capture her voice as much as possible and use excerpts from those letters. So you hear, how smart and witty she is in her own voice. But she didn't have those relationships that went into the 1940s and 1950s. So then I'm left with finding traces of what's in the newspaper. And what's in the newspaper? Well, when she runs out on a hotel bill because she doesn't have enough money, when she pawns some silverware that she stole from a general's house that she was, staying at their house while they were traveling, because she needed the money, and she's, the police are looking for her. So then I don't have her voice like in that period of time, except for the letters that she wrote to this agency when she was trying to write her autobiography. And a few people have asked me, like, what's the one thing like you wish you knew about her life that you don't know? And that last decade, I think it would be hard knowledge, but I would really like to know what the last decade of her life was like and who she was interacting with. And I would like to know where her papers, where all of her stuff ended up, probably in a trash can. But, I live in hope. You never know, right? Somebody has got a box somewhere in the attic that rescued a bunch of papers, at some point. And please call me if you're that person.
Yes, please do, because we all want to know now. We really want to know.
Yes.
And I guess that stayed with me. It's like, I'm like, well, what? But what? How did this happen to us? Because you clearly have so much respect for her, and you're in such awe, and it comes through in your writing about her that it's very difficult for anyone reading your work to then say, oh, I can just leave that on the shelf. I really want to know what happened to Ursula, and I guess her son, he goes on to be quite successful. You mentioned, has he ever talked about his mum?
Well, so first off, he's deceased, obviously in terms of the generations and the years in which he was born,
Obviously,
but he did write the afterword to the one other republication of Ex-Wife happened in the 1980s. And he wrote the afterword to that. And he also, the McNally edition that I held up earlier in the podcast, of Ex-Wife, it includes that same afterword. And it's really worth reading because he was so thoughtful about his mother. I was so moved when I read the way he talked about her, because you know what? She could not have been an easy mother to have, right? She was out there. She was pushing boundaries. She was doing the best she could to raise her son, but having a life, of her own as well, right? So, treasuring the time she spent with him, taking him on road trips, taking him to museums, traveling him to Europe, but then also, he's in boarding schools and, kind of being shuttled around. And so the fact that her son could write with a sense of perspective and distance about his mom's life, I found really amazing. And it's the only reason I know what year she died, and that she died in the charity ward of a hospital, because despite the fact that She was in the newspaper all the time from the late 1920s. I mean, and then when Scandal happened in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was not one obituary published when she died, not one. And I'm very proud to say that I have just drafted an obituary that's more of a biography that the New York Times is going to be running in their Overlooked series. If you know their Overlooked series, it's obituaries that they should have published, but because they only published obituaries of white men, basically in this time period, women and people of color were completely excluded. And so I'm really happy to be able to do that for her, and to acknowledge, her importance, right? This is, obituaries matter because they mark someone's life, and she just kind of like disappeared and nobody was there to tend her legacy.
Yeah, wow. And congratulations on doing that. And that's such an honor to be able to do that for her.
Yeah.
I think that's extraordinary. And I that's the other thing that really struck me is the lack of celebration for her in Hollywood.
Yeah.
That had Hollywood celebrated her at any point, we'd still be hearing about her, because we do know about different directors and different writers and because they were celebrated it in Hollywood at some point in time. And it feels like this woman just sort of swept in, had all this incredible success, made everybody a lot of money, not just herself. We're talking publishers, we're talking studios, film studios, we're talking actors, and she wasn't celebrated. Like, I'm just so blown away by this.
Yeah, there are so many stories like this, right? This is one story of a forgotten woman. There are so many others. I'm a film historian by training. There has been a big movement in film studies in the past, 30 plus years to recover all the women who have contributed to film history globally, right? As directors, we're talking about, in the beginning of film, right? In the 1890s, in the early 1900s, that were just kind of dismissed or footnotes if they were mentioned at all. And so I would say that there is a larger kind of historical recuperation process that we are witnessing right now. And, I am doing my best. There are 10 films, as you noted, that were adapted from Parrott's work. I am traveling the country, doing film programs, introducing films. I started doing this when the book came out in April, and I'm going to be doing it all through 2023. I'm doing my best to get, the films that she had a hand in screened and discussed. One of them is only available at the Library of Congress. It's called Leftover Ladies. It was adapted from a nonfiction story she wrote the year that Ex-Wife came out. And the only copy in the world is a film print at the Library of Congress. So I'm in conversation with them, like, can we get this out on DVD or on a streaming platform? So I hope that the awareness raising has an impact down the line. If people start teaching Ex-Wife, teachers out there that are listening to this, if you start teaching Ex-Wife, this is how we create a new generation of people who know who she is, right? So I do believe in the kind of ripple effect of the things that we do. So like, if you read the book, talk to your friends about it, post about it on social media, write reviews of it. That's the way we generate awareness and change. And so, yes, I'm astonished by how many people don't know who she is, but maybe in 5 years, that won't be the case.
And that'll be because of you, Marsha. And as I said, I did literary studies at university, and I had absolutely, as I said, I'd never heard of her. And I also did feminist studies. So I'm like, how have I not heard about, it's like the two worlds collided, and somehow she was completely missed. And as you say, so sadly, globally, there are so many women who have been forgotten in the annals of history, because we're just like, well, hello. There were so many women out there doing extraordinary things, and it was like they just weren't written about, or it was like they were so quickly forgotten, or men stepped in. It's like you talked about, like Humphrey Bogart was in one of her films. Humphrey Bogart was such an extraordinary star in his day. He would have overshadowed. They wouldn't have been talking about who was the female writer of this movie. Of course they wouldn't have been. Right. They would have just been focusing on the men, as they did for many, many years to come. just extraordinary. But wow, when we look at women who were writing and who made such a difference, we talk about like Virginia Woolf, and we talk about, the Jane Austen, and we talk about a whole lot of women who came in and wrote, originally under either pseudonyms or anonymously, and were trying to get their work published. To see that Ursula was out there and had such enormous success under her own name, not just as an anonymous, but then under her own name, and that I didn't get to learn about her. I didn't get to study her. I didn't get to have these discussions about all these extraordinary things that she did. My big hope now, I'm putting this out into the universe, Marsha, is that your book will be picked up by, I don't know, Reese Witherspoon or Nicole Kidman or Jamie Lee Curtis, or someone who has a production house who is going to say, why aren't we teaching and learning about this extraordinary woman? I hope your book gets picked up. I genuinely hope that there is a film adaptation so that the world will know what an extraordinary woman Ursula was, and that she is no longer forgotten.
Well, from your mouth to Hollywood's ears, Sandy. I mean, her life would make an amazing movie. Absolutely.
True.
And, that's, if you think about, like, go back to the question that Ursula Parrott asked herself, which was like, how do I get my ideas out in the world? And she saw Hollywood as this amazing avenue. She really wanted to use, especially the kind of screenplays that she had a hand in, or the works that she was selling, that she could have some kind of influence over the script on, which was not all of them. She saw this as a way to raise consciousness about issues that mattered to her, especially about women's roles in society as they were changing in this period of time. And so she understood that Hollywood had a reach, that movies had a reach that nothing else had, right? And I think the same could be said for today, right? Like, this is one way, movies are one way that people become aware of things. So, yes, if anyone is out there listening, it's a good story. It's a good story.
It's an extraordinary story, and I genuinely, you can visualize it. You can see what an amazing film this would be, right? Or television series. Hello, Netflix, whatever. But her life is extraordinary. So I think, and as you said, very, very interesting, and not always happy and not always joyous. And there was a lot of, really difficult, extraordinary times that she lived through as well. And, I'm heartbroken that Ursula, that we don't know really who was with her in those end days, which is really quite sad. And, but as you say, very prideful woman, and it kind of makes sense if she was running out, hawking things that didn't belong to her, etc., and the police were after her, and very prideful, and also, probably trying to protect the reputation of her son, who at that time, as you say, has gone to Harvard and was doing really successful. I can understand in some ways why she went, well, I was this in the heady days. And we see it now, even with Hollywood stars now who, according to the media, fall from grace. So they're falling on hard times. They're having a hard time. Their lives are horrendously harassed. They're harassed by paparazzi and media. And I imagine she would have been as well, had she been really putting herself out there at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a matter of fact, when you think about the invasiveness of social media and the way information is spread today, I mean, she lived at a time where the media was trying to get in everyone's business who was in the public eye, right? You couldn't escape it. But imagine now, right? I mean, in some ways, there probably would have been a lot more documentation. But on the other hand, it would have been just immensely tragic exploitation, right? So as much as I feel like I wish I knew more, part of me is glad that there's not more, because the more would have all been, like another arrest, another low point. I don't think at this point in her life that having that additional information, I think it would have been more difficult to process. And, I did feel, thank you for kind of recognizing the respect with which I approached this, because I did feel a a sense of great empathy for her and wanted to tell her story with honesty, but also, giving her the credit for what I think she deserves in terms of literary reputation and reaching an audience today, not just of her life story, but of her words. Like, the most important thing to me is like to read her words, because she's so powerful.
Yeah, extraordinary. And I'm so grateful that you have found her and that you have put her back out into the world where she belongs, because Ursula is a superstar and a hugely successful, powerful feminist voice, a woman who was really creating. She's a pioneer in a lot of ways. I mean, she was just like, not only am I writing about these topics which no one would dare to write about, but she was then, as you say, quite a player in Hollywood, which was no mean feat, even for men in the day, let alone to be a woman who did that as well. So, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart that you've written this book, that you've introduced me to Ursula. And I'm so grateful that you've come on this podcast. And I hope that we can introduce her to a lot more people and get the word out there about Ursula Parrott. And I hope sincerely that Hollywood picks this up and makes it a movie so we can, see her back up on the silver screen where she actually deserves to be.
Well, I hope you'll have me back if that happens, so we can celebrate with a glass of champagne.
Absolutely. Oh, we will. Don't you worry. I will have you back in a heartbeat. You're an extraordinary writer yourself. I think you have treated this with so much love and respect, and it shows. There's a lot of, as you say, you've written with honesty, but also too, you can see that you are really in awe and have a lot of respect for this incredible woman. And thank you for bringing her into my world.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for reading the book. Thank you for talking about it. And I appreciate the word spreading, because that's how we raise awareness.
So true. I've just got to ask this one last question.
Yes.
What do you feel that you've learnt from Ursula through getting to know her and through this extraordinary journey? Because first of all, how long did it take to write the book? Because it's quite a long journey, I'm sure.
Yeah. So it was about a 5-year process from start to finish. But honestly, the only reason it was even that fast is I had 2 amazing fellowships. I had a fellowship from the National Humanities Center and from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a Public Scholar Award, which bought me out of 2 years of my teaching. So I had 2 years. This is all I did 7 days a week, was researching and writing this book. And so, yeah, that was a gift to have that dedicated time, because it really allowed me to be in this project fully and not just doing it, between classes and meetings and things like that. So, so that's the only reason it got done as quickly as it did. But in terms of what I learned, I mean, of course, I learned so much, because there were so many spokes, right, that came out from her story that I ended up doing research about as I read the book. But I mean, my takeaway, I mentioned the kind of optimism and resilience thing, but the other main takeaway I have is that she was just so persistent, like that persistence of, like, she had a vision for a kind of unveiling. She felt like she was revealing something about women's lives through telling her own versions of her own story. And she was really committed to that. And she just kind of kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. And I have to say, like, I really identify with that, because, for every publication you have, for every success you have, there's a trail of rejections, right? That you leave, to this, you get no's all the time in life, but you have to just keep going forward and, finding a way forward, trusting that what you're doing is important. I mean, I will say with this book, when my agent started pitching this book to publishers, we got so many rejections that were the same rejection, which was, this is a fascinating story. This woman sounds so interesting, but there is no market for a book about a woman that nobody's ever heard of, that has no books in print. We cannot sell this book. And
wow.
I remember just sitting at my laptop reading, these rejections would come in going, have I just spent 5 years of my life on an unpublishable book? Because if so, this is really bad. And so when I was so grateful when my acquisitions editor at the trade division at University of California Press, Raina Polivka, was like, as soon as she got the proposal, she was like, I love this project. This is amazing. This story has to be told. I mean, I think I might have wept because I was so happy that someone got it and was not intimidated by putting this book out in the world. But, you know, this was a persistence question. Every day I had to be like, okay, put my big girl pants on and check my email, see what's going to be there today. And so I hope that's the positive trait that I share with Ursula. And I hope that it's one that anyone who's like struggling to do things, put stuff out in the world, just keep at it. It'll happen eventually, but there's a lot of knocks along the way.
Yeah, right. And this is the downside of writing is always that there will be rejections. And I'm so grateful that this book was picked up and published for your sake, but also for
Yes.
Ursula's sake as well. And I think what an extraordinary legacy, though, that you've now left the world is that you've put her front and center. You know, and I love it so much. I'm a huge Ursula fan now, and I'm also a Marsha Gordon fan. So there you go. Congratulations on this extraordinary work.
Thank you so much for your enthusiasm. It makes me so happy to hear from people who have read the book and who are responding to her story. So I'm very easy to find online, and I really do love hearing from people who've read the book.
Wonderful. And we will be sharing all of your social media links
Great.
and links to where people can buy this book. It is extraordinary. The book, of course, is Becoming the Ex-Wife, The Unconventional Life and Forgotten Writings of Ursula Parrott. She is amazing. We'll put up links to your socials, because on your socials, what I really love as well is that you uncovered a tiny little video, which I really love, this black and white footage, and it's Ursula in real life. There she was. I was like, there she is. It's a tiny little snippet, but it's fabulous to watch. And thank you so much for sharing Ursula's story and for putting so much of your heart and soul and your life into it. I'm hugely grateful. It's a brilliant book. Everybody should seriously rush out, buy this book. You will be just enamored by it and by Ursula Parrott, and I'm really glad that I know who she is. As I said, I genuinely believe this would make an extraordinary film, and absolutely, when it happens, Marsha, come back on and we'll be celebrating with Bubbles for sure.
Deal. No problem. Thank you so much, Sandy. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine. Available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.